National President of the Royal New Zealand Air Force Association from 1996 to 2011. In 2010, he stood down after 3 years as National President of the Royal New Zealand Returned and Services Association, which honoured him with his badge in gold and life membership. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to
say that although I'm born and bred a New Zealander, and therefore pathologically incapable of sounding the letter I, service with number 9 Squadron RAAF in Vietnam is not my only personal connection with Australia. My paternal grandfather was born in Uganda, South Australia in 1875. He married Anna Martha Nitschke in Martin, New Zealand in 1905. And 2 generations on, I still have many relatives in the community of 19th century German origin in South Australia. But I did serve, as you've heard, with 9 Squadron for the year from September 1970. Peter Coy was boss for the first 6 months, Peter Mahood for the second. Bruce Martin was Task Force Air Commander. Now I don't have a picture of any of those, but I do have one of Bruce Martin's cars. Characteristically holding court at the officer's mess, and the symbolism I see is not lost on those. I was a squadron leader at the time, and after finding my feet was appointed to the additional duty of TFAC rep at Nuidat, and later flight commander 9 Squadron. With some local encouragement, the idea of crossing the Tasman and transferring to the RAAF had growing appeal over the course of the year, but I chose in the end to remain with the RNZAF and retired in 1995 from the post of Deputy Chief of Defence Force. In all, 16 pilots were seconded from our number 3 Squadron to your number 9 Squadron between 67 and 71. Now on those figures, I grant that the title of this talk, New Zealand's Helicopter War, could be seen as a tad pretentious. We deployed no hardware or infrastructure, only pilots, and only 16 across 5 years. And having acknowledged that, this is also the place to remark that I'm going to talk about the operational side only, because that is the business we were in. But let me acknowledge that the RAAF's technical, admin, and is it now going?
How's that? I'll just turn my hearing aids off. Yeah, but as I was saying, let me acknowledge that the RAAF's technical, admin and domestic support that we took for granted was never anything less than superb. For our fixed-wing FACs who served with the United States Air Force, it was the same, our pilots flying other people's aircraft. And it was the same again with the often overlooked New Zealand Army helicopter pilots who flew with 161 Recce flight. They were only 5, though we might add the additional 2 soldier pilots who flew briefly and controversially with US Army units early on, and I'll come back to that later. Now, given their modest numbers, I thought I might be excused for listing the RNZAF names briefly. Initially in 1967 they were posted in 2 at a time, but that was soon expanded to 4. One of the first pair was John Clements, who had been posted to number 5 Squadron at Fairburn on a 2-year exchange, but found himself with the unexpected gift of a wartime tour with number 9 Squadron for the last 6 months. Most of the rest did 12 months, except for Ian Brunton, who was repatriated early for medical reasons. Now, I'm a bit short on pictures of all of these, and you wouldn't want to see them anyway, but here's one of Doug Patterson. Dimly. And in his logbook, Ron McKim wrote, "I consider Patterson to be a wonderful New Zealander. I also consider him to be an exceptional Australian." Signed McKim. And here are two more. John Pendry on the left with Gordon Wood on the right. Now, until 1969, RNZAF pilots were required by Australia to train with number 5 Squadron at Fairburn before going on to 9 Squadron. I make no comment on that. Safe to say that since it represented the difference at that time between making or not making a combat contribution in the air, it was accepted on my side of the Tasman. A 17th name you might have noticed was on the list. That's Bill Waterhouse, who at the time was the only Maori helicopter pilot in the world. And in 1969 he was killed in a mast bumping accident at 5 Squadron. His country school in Hawke's Bay recently dedicated a memorial to him in the form of an Iroquois main razor blade mounted vertically. But by coincidence at that time, it was becoming clear that the additional training wasn't adding much of value to either air force. And all subsequent RNZAF secondees went direct from our number 3 Squadron to your number 9 without the detour through 5. As far as I know, the change caused no sleepless nights anywhere. The Kiwis simply merged in. If there were any concerns about flying standards or culture shock, they just melted away. Even the sheep jokes were muted. And assaults on the senses like this were simply absorbed. It's silent.
Coming up is to Mick and Steve again, and
AFR from Tao, the Australian sound in Vietnam.
well, the time is currently 21.5 minutes past 4 o'clock. Well, our next request coming up is to Mick and Steve again, and the request for Roger Miller and In the Summertime.
1, 2, 3. In the summertime, 1 hour, 3 leaves the green.
Very contemporary. But more seriously, let me back up a little to something I said a moment ago, finding my feet in the operational environment of Vietnam. What I want to say is connected with something we've heard about this morning, and I think we'll hear more about it this afternoon. The challenges entailed in growing a credible combat capability, not only from a standing start, but also under actual combat pressures. By 1970, when I arrived, number 9 Squadron was making it very clear to all new arrivals that irrespective of rank or what you think you might know, you will not grasp what's going on here until you have spent time finding out, and to our satisfaction, not yours. No doubt this chafed with some, but I've believed ever since that it was one of the most intelligent rules I've encountered in any military unit anywhere. It worked well. It protected the young from youthful over-enthusiasm without straitjacketing, and it protected those who were longer in the tooth from making fools of ourselves or worse. And what it taught could not be taught anywhere except in the combat conditions of Vietnam itself. Now I can illustrate the gist of why I say this. On the 27th of March 1971, I was co-pilot with this man. There he is, Dick Whitman, in Bush Ranger 71. Bob Stevens was crewman, Barry Hogan was the gunner. Northwest of Nui Dat, elements of Bravo Company 2 Ra were in thick jungle, about to engage a group of Viet Cong with the gunships in support. I hooked a cassette recorder into the radio and intercom. Now last year that tape, or cassette tape, was starting to disintegrate, and our Ministry of Cultural Heritage was kind enough to digitise it. That involved destroying the tape in order to save it, but it worked. The action was over an hour long. Here's a clip of the opening radio traffic between the aircraft and the soldiers on the ground.
0, 0, good practice, 1 0.
still never. For winter 2000, position is 1970, start. 200 chapter consistent of tendency, so that is equal at 200 oil, wet, that is. We have a impact to wait to exact cap.
Okay, now, you've heard that exactly as it was on the day. There's been no editing of that content. But what you've heard shows clearly that unlike in the movies, in real life there is confusing traffic on multiple radio channels, including unwanted intrusions and interference that gets in the way of meaning. Sifting the essentials from the rubbish is a challenge in itself. But an additional and very spiky edge to that is the knowledge that should misinformation or misunderstanding cause mistakes in applying lethal force, the consequences can be dire. The snippet affirms that learning from the scripted sterility of exercise training, though that's necessary, can be only a first step in getting to grips with the complications of the fog of war. Or at least that's what it indicates to me. But there's something else. The demands of combat can make reputations or just as easily puncture them, quite often cruelly. Faced with the fast-moving realities of action, I've seen some of the young and inexperienced pick things up astonishingly quickly. Not each and every one, but some. I've also seen cases of the older and maybe bolder falling short. So the enduring lesson I've carried with me ever since is always to distinguish very carefully between experience and ability, and perhaps more importantly, never to underestimate the ability of the more capable young to cope with difficult situations. All of which suggest that the needed abilities are at least as much a talent as a skill. And seeing talent rise to the challenge in the exacting conditions of real combat was an encouraging counterweight to the effort that sometimes had to be put in to those who needed to work a little harder. But let's return to the recording. Intelligible radio contact is made on 0 Alpha, and he's passed on a channel change for a tactical briefing by call sign 20.
20, call sign 20, return to set 1 area. Call sign 20, return to set 1. I'm not getting you very closely. Would you give us a technical situation now? This is broken. Call sign 21 is identified. Enemy entering.
Okay, now, for oral legibility is obviously still a factor, but note how Dick reads back the essentials. These exchanges went on for considerably longer than we've played, but we've heard enough to bring out the meticulous attention to detail, which again is at odds with the fancies of Hollywood. There is another scenario, however, in which matters can be immensely more difficult. And this applies to something that was raised this morning, the dust-off mission in particular, but not only that. In what we've been listening to, the initiative lay with us, with time to consider all angles. That contrasts very sharply with the case when the initiative was with the antagonist, when we are reacting to events rather than managing them. Then the luxury of time to plan is absent, and the stress both of the action itself and of the consequences of wrong calls rises very steeply. So once again, the practice of testing everyone before licensing them was a good one. Now to continue, the next clip has Dick briefing his crew. You'll also hear 9 authentic grandmother things from a possum of 161 Record.
This is Nina on uniform. Call sign 21 proposes to commence the action in 3 minutes 7. So 1 minute. Call sign 20.
northeast. And there are two other call signs which are not over one canal for 2 picks southeast. They put a ride is at 21 Alpha, a part of 21. And this is and the 21 minus initiated contact. 21 Alpha, the partner started contact initiated, he will reform after 21 minus, move north 100 metres. If by any chance you called in early, if you move very downwards now. That's the call sign.
Yeah, you're afraid that they did their contact and say the time left together. Right, 10 forward, 15 minutes southwest. Yeah, maintaining southwest.
Have you got any movement down here?
Okay, again, that clip is shorter than the reality, but we see attention being given to ensuring that everybody knows both detail and intent. And you heard the pitch rise at the moment of contact. We also see something of the importance of teamwork, for example, ensuring the gunship leader captain, Dick Whitman, knew the action had begun despite his being off radio and personally missing that particular moment. The original tape considers with much traffic about smoke markers and other details to establish clearly where the friendly elements actually were. And then in this final clip, 2-1 requests a dummy run before clearing the gunships to fire live. That done, you'll hear them the needs on the door guns.
Right, it's 1, 2, 1, if you could make a dummy pass, we actually go 0, 1, 0, 0,
He wants a dummy pass before you start.
Right. 1, 2, 1, if you get one after dummy pass.
So he wants to just go on and he's going to do it for a rolling dummy pass at this time.
Over the top of us, is this normal?
2-1, 10-1, that's about it.
Oh, this is 2-1, Roger, I just wasn't quite sure of that one.
Sure, is dry. Many down there? Sunny down.
Okay, now note the continued and methodical caution, including the dummy run. Note also that call sign 2-1 wanted reassurance that the aircraft braking overhead was normal. Now this also tells us something which to my mind is much more basic and important than methodical procedure itself. That lesson is this: when the shooting starts, it is absolutely vital not only that the aviator understands the soldier and his problems, but equally that the soldier understands the aviator and his problems. We hear all too often that the aviator must understand the soldier to be effective. While nobody would argue with that, it omits fully half of this most important equation. What all that radio chatter was about was ensuring that each understood the other in full, without reservation and with trust. Significantly, where there were uncertainties, the players were not shy of asking. Now that reciprocated understanding matters above all else. It's scarcely surprising, therefore, that those who were faced with setting up a helicopter combat operation suddenly and without precedent, and especially given that the battlefield itself can be the harshest tutor, might have found the going a bit uneven to begin with. And this applies equally to the Army's appreciation of what the helicopter can do or cannot do, particularly where it needs to be managed as a scarce resource not available in profligate numbers. We can accept, I think, that the learning ramps were steep in the beginning, possibly even vertical. It's not unreasonable also to suppose that this would still have been so had the aviators been in khaki rather than in blue at that time. Certainly the need for deep and mutual understanding of the needs of the soldier and the aviator transcends the colour of uniform. And the lesson line beneath that is an old one. Modern warfare is come as you are. It offers no shortcuts to proficiency and can even penalise assumptions that they might be found. And so I think it's a great oversimplification to suggest that inter-service command arrangements were themselves the principal or even a significant cause of occasional difficulties in delivering helicopter support at call to the soldier on the ground. I have difficulty with the notion that organic command would necessarily have resulted in better support. Pure command arrangements weren't the core question. Rather, success depended on soldiers and aviators learning in the heat of battle itself what was sensibly possible and what was not. After all, an aircraft brought down cheaply or unnecessary on top of a contact will cause perverse complications in the ground battle. And in the wider setting, there also exists the in-your-face example of the most prolific user of battlefield helicopters the world has known. That made things no easier because the constrained scale of the helicopter resource available to one ATF stood out more sharply in comparison. But fiddling with command arrangements on their own was never going to soften that contrast. Now I have to confess that I completed the entire 12 months with No. 9 Squadron, including as TFAC rep and as flight commander, with the blissful advantage of being able to claim ignorance of the partisan baggage sometimes carried by both Army and Air. Now in saying that, I don't mean to suggest that I was unaware, because some of the body language was plain to see, especially as TFAC rep. But for me, and the other Kiwis I suspect, it did not play as keenly as it seemed to do for some of our hosts, whether in blue or khaki. Now I don't mean to claim here either that there weren't echoes of similar things in New Zealand, because that would be dishonest. There were, but they were generally less acute. There could be many reasons for that. The most obvious is that the New Zealand national arrangements, command arrangements, were never tested in combat, whereas the Australian arrangements most certainly were. But other factors might also have been in play. For example, the New Zealand LOH and UH helicopters were purchased expressly for the purpose of tactical support to the Army in the field. SAR was a spin-off task, not the primary. Then, for reasons of critical mass, all helicopters were assigned to the Air Force Order of Battle. Thus, it was no accident that the unit reformed to discharge all helicopter tactical support tasks was named No. 3 Battlefield Support Squadron. It included Air Force, Army and Navy pilots. It was also home to a cadre of ground staff of the New Zealand Army Aviation Corps. The intersection between Army and Air Force was comprehensively built in. The permanent presence of the Army Aviation Corps within the Air Force provider unit meant that channels remained open to resolve issues before they festered, at least at the level of operational detail. Things were not always so equable at higher levels, although in retrospect most of the arisings were minor in nature and even outright petty. In that category we might put the restriction that the Army pilots were permitted to fly only the LOH aircraft, not the UH-1. Yet naval pilots were routinely employed on both the naval chopper and the UH-1, so the policies were basically inconsistent to begin with. With all that said, the 5 New Zealand Army pilots who flew with 161 Recce Flight in Vietnam had learned their aviator trade within No. 3 Squadron, RNZAF. That they equipped themselves so well suggests that the arrangements had not led to untoward cross-contamination. At one point in Vietnam, however, the UH-1 restriction on Army pilots caused an eruption of sorts. In 1965, after much dithering over whether to add combat troops to existing non-combat commitments in Vietnam, the government finally decided to send No. 161 battery. Unremarkably, that included forward observers. 2 of those happened to be qualified Army helicopter pilots, fresh from active LOH duties during confrontation in Malaysia. Now I need to emphasise that all of this took place well before considerations arose of sending aircrew as aircrew. Even so, the 2 qualified pilot FOs retrained in country to fly the UH-1 with the US Army Aviation Battalion. Exactly how that came about is not clear, but it wasn't unnatural that artillery forward observers should take to the air. But it did have unfortunate consequences both at the inter-service level and at a political level, well above the immediacies of making things work in the field. When a senior RNZAF officer found out by accident that NZ Army helicopter pilots were flying US Army Iroquois, the RNZAF got very grumpy. In late 1966, another senior officer examined the possible deployment of RNZAF aircrew instead. He was annoyed when the New Zealand Air Force staff in Saigon told him that the US Army would not accept RNZAF helicopter pilots at any price because, quote, they lacked field tactical experience. That he had not found any such reservations by the Americans did not improve his mood. So the chances of a non-partisan or uncluttered view of the tenure of the two Army pilots all but disappeared at that point. Then at the political level, the situation became more cluttered still. When the military sought government leave to replace one of the Army pilots with an airman, Prime Minister Holyoake, known as Kiwi Keith, wanted to know why activities were taking place, quote, without proper authority. The Minister of Defence was asked to explain how it was that New Zealand Army helicopter pilots had participated without government knowledge in American operations in Vietnam. Explanations by the CGS that aerial observation was intrinsic to the artillery mission were to no avail. The Prime Minister wrote huffily that, and I quote, Cabinet cannot accept the proposition that approval for one specific commitment is capable of being modified by private arrangement within the services. That sounded the knell for the two Army pilots. The RNZAF's parochialism was satisfied. Cabinet then agonised for months over a follow-up proposal that a single RNZAF helicopter pilot should be sent to gain operational experience on the Iroquois with the Americans. The government wanted assurance that no New Zealand pilots would be employed on operations over North Vietnam or Cambodia or in dealing with civil disturbance. It was not until mid-67 that RNZAF helicopter pilots were sent to Vietnam, but what are the details? Earlier, Wing Commander Ewan Jamieson, who was our senior airman in Malaysia, later our CDF, had reported RAAF warnings that US tactics in Vietnam was profligate and lost, that their maintenance was slipshod, and that their tendency to overload helicopters was dangerous. Now please bear in mind that I'm only reporting material from the contemporary record. I'm not passing judgment on American or Australian helicopter operations. My sources for these two studies of 2005 and 2010. There are many other tracts, of course, but most are in the manner of personal reminiscence rather than a scholarly history. These two are authoritative. Dr. McGibbon is one of the senior historians of the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, and Dr. Roberto Rebel, similarly, but he's based in Dunedin at Otago University. So those two works provide the factual basis I've drawn upon for this talk. And so the RNZAF pilots went to number 9 Squadron, not to an American unit. But the government remained nervous about the domestic political effects of being seen to escalate our warlike involvement in Vietnam. Involving itself directly in the detailed employment of individual helicopter pilots is evidence of that. Indeed, Rebel remarks that Cabinet's rebuke of the military over the two Army pilots threatened a serious breach of trust between the civil and military authority. And one can see that any ambition within the RNZAF that a fixed-wing air combat element might be deployed was full on. Although we did eventually send 14 FACs to the United States Air Force. But again, only for operations within South Vietnam, cross-border operations were not to be permitted. Now, seen through that lens, it also seems possible that another of Jamieson's observations might have played a part. And this is my own interpretation. He'd suggested that if attached to the Americans, it could be difficult for New Zealand pilots to avoid being used in gunships. Now, two footnotes to history arise from that. First, as you and I know, any calculation that RNZAF pilots would not be involved in gunship operations if placed within an Australian unit proved to be among the least well-founded of expectations. One of the New Zealanders, Trevor Butler, was involved in the development of the RAAF gunship and took part, I believe, in their first operational mission. Here he is on the right with Ted Creelman, another New Zealander who was likewise involved. Others also flew as gunship pilots, including myself. In similar vein, I know that some of our FACs regularly cross borders, not in defiance of government wishes, but because they had to do so or fail the mission. Not unlike the case of the two Army pilots flying US UH-1s, what seems to be pretty plain here is that real operational practicalities in the field can and will say more about what people do than attempts by anyone remote from the battlefield, including politicians, to circumscribe the activities of those they send to war. The second footnote is a fascinating insight from Rebel's book on the politics. In late 1967, it was proposed that we should double our contribution to 9 Squadron from 2 parts to 4. One of the heavyweights of New Zealand's diplomatic firmament, George Laking, shown here on the right, with Key and Holyoake, told the Prime Minister that the additional pilots were not part of New Zealand's military contribution to South Vietnam because their deployment was, and I'm quoting directly, the deployment was essentially an arrangement between the New Zealand and Australian Air Forces, which helped meet an Australian need. So be that. Until I read it, I hadn't known that I'd been said not to stand at the Communist gate, but to help Australia out of a hole. And I suspect that neither did. But obviously the foreign affairs and defence bureaucracies were looking to express their own convictions in a way that a reluctant government could accept. Even unto a startling reversal of earlier insistence that political authority should always prevail over military utility. Suddenly what was yesterday's sin was to be today's virtue. We might observe too that placement of the helicopter resource has led to starkly different outcomes in our two countries. In Australia, land-based helicopters were passed to the Army. The Australian Army Aviation Corps thrives and the Air Force's Air Combat Force continues. In contrast, in New Zealand, the helicopters were retained by the Air Force, but neither the Army Aviation Corps nor an Air Combat Force now exists. And again, I offer no comment on that, I'm simply stating fact. Now, having said all that, we all know that the SAS in particular was very well served by 9 Squadron, and they know it too. But here's a tale from the perspective of a New Zealand soldier, an infantryman. On the 17th of April 1970, Lieutenant Stan Kidd of the 4th Rotation of Victor Company 1 RNZAF was on patrol just days before the end of his tour, and he was killed in contact. Unbidden, he had earlier formed a close rapport with 9 Squadron and had made his appreciation known. Chivas Regal mounted rampant between Ho Chi Minh Sandals Couchon, bearing the legend to those magnificent men in their flying machines, number 9 Squadron, RAAF. That nectar was to have been shared at his farewell on return to New Zealand, but that never took place. And sadly, I've not been able to find out what happened to the trophy as a whole. Let me wind all this up by remarking that occasionally army banter was not the only societal matter to be dealt with. The means by which a minority might attract the notice of the many can sometimes be problematic. In the setting of Anzac, the ground can be further tilted because what is referred to with varying degrees of immodesty as trans-Tasman rivalry on my side of the ditch is a phenomenon often unnoticed by your side. And that rather adds to the challenge. Early on, one of our number made a papier-mâché model of a kiwi to hang from the ceiling of the officers' mess bar. This was known as Kiwi Corner. Over time, the kiwi suffered many indignities of the kind to be expected from living in a bar. This is the original, the battered, but with a kangaroo in his talons. And riposte they call Kiwi same fat chop. The kangaroo's placard announces, "I am a jumping fat rat." Now, during my tour, Chris Peters set out to replace the alien bird with the new one in more durable plaster of Paris. And here's the sculpture, with at least part of the sculptor. One night we presented this replacement to the PMC. They quickly fixed it to the ceiling by stainless steel chain, hopefully proof against bolt cutters. But our care to protect this endangered species didn't work for long. Within minutes, our new plaster kiwi had a dart up its nether region. I guess I'd better leave it there. So to reflect that there were 5 DFCs and 2 MIDs among our 16 UH-1 pilots. 2 became flight commander, 3 were appointed as TFAC rep, and of the 5 Army pilots with 161 recce, 2 were awarded the DFC. And with all due modesty, I reckon that adds up to something done passingly well. It was not an aircraft, but indoors. Thank you.